Okay, so chapter 6 deals with getting food. So for us, it's pretty simple. We usually go down to the grocery store and put food in our baskets and bring it home. But for most non-commercial societies, it's a little bit more involved in that, and the people within the culture are more directly involved in getting the food for themselves and their families. So here are some of the topics we'll cover. So different types of food getting strategies. You probably heard of hunter-gatherers before, or also known as foragers, or also known as food collectors. So if you hear me use the terms hunter-gatherer, forager, or food collector, they're all three the same thing. So foraging, or food collection, is generally defined as a food-getting strategy that obtains wild plant and animals through gathering, hunting, scavenging, or fishing. So, as I said, I think we've heard the term hunter-gatherer before, so just as that implies, it's hunting and gathering of the food. So the book gives two examples of foragers. They give the example of an Inuit group in the Arctic, which we'll talk about here, and we'll talk about kind of the general features of foraging and complex foragers, which are a little bit different than just your typical foragers. So you'll notice the way that this chapter is set up is it'll talk about a food-giving strategy. It'll give you a couple examples of groups that engage in that food-getting strategy, and then it'll talk about general characteristics of the cultures that are involved in that type of food-getting strategy. So with foraging, general features or typical characteristics of foragers are that they live in small communities. So foraging cannot support large groups of people. So these are small communities. They're typically nomadic. So I'm going to use the term in this chapter nomadic and then sedentary. So nomadic means that people move around. Sedentary means they stay in one place. So with foragers, they are typically nomadic. That means they don't stay in one place for very often, and it's usually seasonal in that they'll follow, hunting migrations and those sorts, or animal migrations for hunting and those sorts of things. So foragers live in small communities, typically nomadic, which is another reason why they're small. If you got a large group of people that you're going to pick up and move every so often, it makes it a little bit harder. And as with all societies, division of labor is based on age and gender. So with foragers, typically the women are the ones that do the gathering and the men are the ones that do the hunting. So those are some general characteristics of foragers. Kind of a offshoot of foraging is called complex foragers, and these are like foragers, except for they tend to be more sedentary, which means that they stay in one place more often, and then typically, because of that, also have slightly higher populations. And it's most likely associated with fishing as a food-getting strategy. So if you're, in case you've got a certain bend along the river where you can catch fish on a regular basis, the food is consistent in that particular area, then they tend to be a bit more sedentary, and we call those complex foragers. So here's what we just kind of went through with foragers. This particular table that you find on page 135, table 6.1, is going to be an important table for you because it's going to list out kind of those general characteristics of each of these food-getting strategies, which you're going to want to know. So again, and it's focused on population size, whether they're mobile or stay in one place, how often they get food shortages. So for foragers, it's infrequent. They usually have enough food to feed everyone. Whether they allow for full-time craft specialists, if there's usually social stratification or individual differences in wealth, and also the political leadership. So you want to come back to this. This one is an important table for learning the general characteristics. So that was food collection. Now, food production is relatively new in human history. So for most of human history, we were foragers. We were hunter-gatherers. And then roughly about 10,000 years ago, we started to see people producing their own food. And this is, you'll hear the term independent invention. So food production is an independent invention. It happened independently in different times and places. So the first evidence is in the Mesopotamia or modern day Iraq area, where we've got people starting to produce their own food. And so we've come up with three types of food production system. There's horticulture, intensive agriculture, and pastoralism, and we'll talk about each of these. So horticulture is the growing of, kind of think of it like gardening. It's the growing of crops of all kinds with relatively simple tools and methods. So prehistorically here in Iowa, they would use the scapula of a bison as part of their hoe that they would fasten onto a stick, and so a simple tool to garden with under horticulture. And so the two horticultural societies that the book talks about are the Yanomamo and the Samoans. And so you can, again, with each of these different food getting strategies, you can read about the examples in the book. Okay, so another type of food production is intensive agriculture. So this is, whereas horticulturalists tend to be a little more nomadic in that they will seasonally move around. They might garden along a plot for a few years and then move to a new plot. Intensive agriculture is more what we're used to in that it's a permanent cultivation of one field in over many years using more complex tools. So two groups of intensive agriculturists you read about in the book is rural Greece and rural Vietnam. So pastoralism is nomadic. It's a group of people that domesticate animals and move them around to different grazing areas throughout the seasons. And so the two pastoral societies that the book talks about are the Bassarai and the Sami. So pastoralism is typically practiced in grassland regions of the earth, again for grazing purposes. But a lot of, with globalization the way it is, these kind of pastoralists and foragers are being kind of pushed into marginal environments today that are less desirable for them than they would have had in the past. So it's not that hard to believe that pastoralism would require a grassland environment. So you would think that, and it does, environmental restraints happen on food getting strategies. So back to foraging with the Inuit, they're going to rely heavily on sea mammals and not a lot on plants, because up in the Arctic they don't have a lot of growing time. Things are usually cold and dry, and the food that they have available to them is a lot of times animals. So that environmental restraint is going to have an aspect on how they get food and what food they get. But we like to think of it more as a restraining factor than a determining factor. So it doesn't determine what kind of food they would get, but certainly restrains their options. So here and with again, these kind of foragers and horticulturalists and pastoralists are being pushed into these marginal environments. And what would have traditionally been all of the world would have traditionally been a foraging environment up until food production and the historically within the last 10,000 years, just kind of the more complex and large population societies that we have. So here's an aerial view of an irrigated field in California, but in the past this environment would have just supported foragers. So what brought about food production? So with food production, you're able to support more people not everyone has to be involved in getting the food. And so it has there's benefits to producing your own food, and there's benefits to foraging. So with foragers, they don't have food shortages as often, and if they did, it's not as devastating as it would be for intensive agriculturalists or commercial agriculturalists. And so there are advantages to food production and disadvantages. So what were some of the conditions that may have pushed people from foraging into food production? One theory or idea is that population growth in regions of bountiful wild resources. So maybe 10,000 years ago, you have this situation where there's bountiful resources and people didn't have to move around. They supported larger populations. And then the natural transition would be in order to keep supporting that, would be to produce your own food. Or the idea that this was happening globally, and food production was the only way to kind of sustain this global population rise. And around 10,000 years ago would have been a climactic, we have climactic records of this time period that show us that we were getting into hotter, drier summers and colder winters, and that may have been a factor in why people switched over to food production. Once food production happened, and again it happened in separate times and places, we've talked about diffusion, and so it would be the spread of food production. So once someone in an area had figured out how to produce food, that idea would spread from that particular center. So the competition for land between food producers and food collectors, the food producers may have had a significant advantage because they can support larger populations. Not everyone is involved in getting the food, so you have a few farmers maybe who provide food for other things from others in the community. So you can start to have things like a military and social stratification and that sort of thing. And so food collectors may have an advantage over foragers, and could have then kind of pushed their food producing ways onto the foragers. So that is a quick version of chapter 6 there. Hopefully I added in some things that is helpful, that would be helpful for you as you learn this material, and feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions. Thanks.